you have to endure another 30 minutes. We appreciate the good questions. I think we got more after we ended the question period than we did before, but some good ones. Back to our why question. Why do you think the earth is old? First one, radiometric dating, well, that's not quite as good an answer as many think it is, as we can demonstrate. Now, why do you think it's old? Well, the next response usually involves the layers and the fossils, and look at all of these thousands of layers and the fossils in the rocks, and it takes millions of years to form the fossils and these layers and the rocks. So it just looks very old when you look at the Grand Canyon, for example. Now, why? Well, it's usually the next response, and that's kind of like Brer Rabbit and the briar patch. That's where I wanted to go anyway. Because in geology, you see, that's not the case at all. It doesn't look old. The more you learn about geology, the more that becomes obvious. But it reminds me of what we see here in the family circus, where the little boy says, how big does a stone have to grow before it becomes a rock? And we chuckle at that. Well, of course, rocks don't grow. Well, you haven't taken geology then, because yes, that's basically what we're told when we're told about sedimentation rates, and rock accumulates at a just minuscule rate. Schustert, back in 1931, published this chart about how fast rock forms, and the majority of it down in the Paleozoic is 1 foot per 2,700 years. That's almost 3,000 years a foot in the majority of the column. 3,000 years to form a foot of rock. That's growing pretty good. Well, I was in school class not too long ago and asked the question, how do fossils form? How do rocks form? And this fellow stood up in the back of the class and he says, well, a fish dies and over millions of years a rock grows around him. And that's what he was taught. How many of you know of rocks growing? Do rocks grow? We know that's not true, but he's taught that and he just parrots it like he was taught. If rocks grew, you could build your house out of rock, and over the next 100,000 years, you'd have an extra bedroom maybe or something. Rocks don't do that. They deteriorate, don't they? And yet, when we know that, we still see students accepting it, even though they know better. Here's a rate that was proposed by Officer and Drake in extinction: 1 centimeter per 1,000 years. That's even a lot slower. 1 centimeter per 1,000 is typical. And these are leading authorities in the field. Well, let's think about that. Dunbar and Rogers wrote the textbook Principles of Stratigraphy that I was taught from at 2 different state universities. And they're very knowledgeable, and this is a standard stratigraphy textbook, studying the strata or the layers. And they say this is a problem. To some thoughtful stratigraphers, this amazing discovery, the idea of billions of years that radiometric dating is supposed to confirm, this presented a dilemma. For if the known stratified rocks have been accumulating throughout this vast span of time, the average rate of deposition must have been extremely slow, which is what Schustert said in his chart. Yet there is very good evidence that individual beds accumulated rapidly, which is not what Schustert said. It'd be just the opposite. Well, what kind of good evidence are these evolutionists saying? Well, we look at this. Do you know what that is? It looks like a shrimp, doesn't it? It's not. It's a rock. Now let's think about this rock for a minute. Shrimp lays out on the beach. How long does it take to turn into a rock? Now, does shrimp, you can put shrimp in the refrigerator and it'll last for years and years and years, right? What about if it's laying out on the beach? How long is it going to look like this? Think about it. What's going to happen to the shrimp when it's laying out or at the bottom of the ocean even? It's going to get eaten. It's not. Now, how long did it take that rock to form? 1 million years? A week? I don't think you could get this kind of rock if it formed in a week. It has to form just within hours in order to get this kind of preservation. We're looking here at a large heron and a perch in the process of eating the other fish, eating his supper. Now, sometimes I get the privilege of eating with my brethren, and some of them just are real slow eaters, and it's a little aggravating. But, 100,000 years to eat a meal is a little much. Or in this case, it's a 3-foot fish. Schuster's rate, that's well over 1,000 years to eat that fish. He got caught in the concrete. That happened quickly, or you won't get that. These are some big fat fish that were formed or found near Ellis County, or in Ellis County, just a few miles from where I live. How long is a fish going to look like that? 100 years? While it forms into a rock? That's, just a few afternoons, and they're not going to look like that. We're looking here at a fern that hasn't had time to wilt, but it's a rock. How long does it take a fern to wilt? Here, the top picture is a rock. Bottom picture is a fern being held in place. What happens when you turn it loose? Boing. The rock was formed before it sprang back, while it was still held in place, before it wilted. How long does it take? Well, just less than an hour sometimes you can see obvious wilting with a fern. Now just look at the rocks and think. 3,000 years for a foot. Does that make sense in terms of what we see in the rocks? Dunbar and Rogers themselves say internal evidence in the strata belies these estimates. Schuster's chart. In the coal measures of Nova Scotia, for example, the stumps and trunks of many trees are preserved standing upright as they grew, clearly having been buried before they had time to fall or rot away. Here, sediment certainly accumulated to a depth of many feet within a few years, and you see this fairly often. Here's a picture from near Cookeville, Tennessee, and we see a coal seam down at the bottom. We see another coal seam up at the top, and we see dozens of layers intervening. Now, obviously, a coal seam takes hundreds of thousands of years to form, right? What's going to happen to the top of the tree? We're looking at basically one event. Has to be, right, in order to preserve the tree. And it's as well preserved at the top as it is at the bottom. 43 feet from top to bottom. How long does it take coal to form? Think about that. Before the tree rotted, we see this having to form to preserve it. Sometimes we find, as in this case, 50 different trees. Now, they're truncated top and bottom, no roots, no limbs, but here they're buried upright, having been transported and buried quickly and turned into rock. What would do something like that? Millions and millions of years. I don't think so. That's just not going to fly. Dunbar and Rogers go on to say, abundant fossil shells likewise indicate rapid burial. At the rate of deposition postulated by Schuster, 1,000 years more or less would have been required to bury a shell 5 inches in diameter. With very local exceptions, fossil shells show no evidence of such long exposure. That's not what we see, but that's what they preach. In spite of what they see, this is an ammonite from Dallas, Texas, a beautifully iridescent shell. You can find some shells with this mother of pearl iridescent. Lay it out in the sunshine, it's gone in an afternoon. This one's supposed to be 135 million years old. Preserving even the iridescence. Had to form quickly. We're looking here at a fossil wolf spider. Now, this gets to be almost comical. In fact, it just makes me mad sometimes. This is a sign that you can see at the National Monument at Florissant Fossil Beds, Colorado Springs. Maybe some of you have been there, sort of a tourist attraction. And you go in and you see these fossil insects. And here's the sign. 2 inches equals 1,000,000 years. Now get your computer out, get your calculator out, and do some figuring here. Human hair is pretty small. Now, at the rate 2 inches per 1 million years, how long would it take to cover a human hair? 2,500 years. And yet you're going to, at that rate, preserve this spider beautifully. You think? I think that's just nonsense. It's not even very good nonsense. It's just idiocy. Anybody that thinks and does any kind of figuring can see this is nuts. And yet it passes for science, and we're paying for it at our national parks. It's just propaganda. Some of you may be familiar with the jellyfish. This is just almost nothing. It's just kind of mucusy. The most flimsy living thing that we know anything about, floating along in the ocean. Lays up on the beach and just lasts for hundreds of years. You think? Well, we got fossils of them. Here's fossil of a jellyfish. And in some places we have beautiful fossils of quite a few of them, along with the ripple marks, which only last just a few hours by the way. Some of these jellyfish are just beautifully preserved. Even the mouth parts can be seen in this mucus. Now just think and be honest. How long did it take that rock to form? You get the picture. It is not a long time. They can. How many people sat around and watched the 3,000-year foot of rock to form? That's propaganda. They assume the age of the formation, they divide the age into the rock, and they get the feet per rock, per age and per year. And they're assuming the answer with their assumptions to start with. And you look at the rocks themselves, and it's just not so. We're looking here at a large ichthyosaur. It's supposed to be kin to a fish because it looks like a fish. Kinship's supposed, well, no. This is a reptile. That's another lecture, but similarity doesn't always indicate kinship. But here is about a 28-foot reptile that looks like a fish, beautifully preserved. We look at the close-up and we see some of the adipose tissue, the fatty tissue, beautifully preserved in the Soldenhofen limestone. This is over in Germany. And looking closely at the mid portion of mummy ichthyosaur, you can see baby ichthyosaur, the embryo inside the ichthyosaur. And obviously some of these mothers were buried catastrophically because as a consequence they gave premature birth and got frozen in the act of giving birth, frozen in the limestone, which formed at the rate of 3,000 years a foot. You think? No, they just don't think. That's the problem. Anybody that looks at that says, hey, that's crazy. Looking at a close-up, you can see the embryo being ejected, and there's probably a dozen of them like that in this area that are in the process of premature birth. They're catastrophically covered up and buried, caught in the concrete, which is the same chemical formula, by the way, as limestone, calcium carbonate. We're looking here at willow, which is a dinosaur that is now at North Carolina State University, found not too far from there. Beautifully preserved, and notice the description here in the museum. What are the odds of finding a fossilized dinosaur heart? Seemingly impossible has occurred within the 66 million year old skeleton, which that's a sacrosanct conclusion. You don't question that. It has, question anything else, but it has to be this old. The structure of the heart surprisingly advanced, and you can tell because you got it beautifully preserved. We're looking here at the center portion of the chest, and there's the heart of the dinosaur. Now we see the people transplanting hearts, and they got dry ice in the box, and they're running across the top of the roof into the helicopter and flying off to the hospital because the heart would deteriorate quickly. This one turned into rock. Here is an X-ray of this of willow. This is a CAT scan. Here we see the scapula. And then in the upper section, this is the neck vertebrae. But down here in the middle, we see the left ventricle, right ventricle of the heart of the dinosaur. In the center, the ventricular septum, all of the detailed parts of the dinosaur heart. If that rock didn't form quickly, I mean, that's just crazy not to think that. And then looking at this slice of rock, we see blood cells. This is from a Tyrannosaurus rex. Inside the bones, blood cells. Notice the research news report in Science magazine. Round, tiny, nucleated, they were threaded through the bone like red blood cells and blood vessels. But blood cells in a dinosaur bone should have disappeared eons ago, if you believe in the eons. I got goosebumps. It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. The bones are, after all, 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Well, somehow they did, because you know it's 65 million years old. You have faith, or else you'll lose your job. I think that needs to be questioned, and for very good reason, very obvious reasons. Alan Van Joplin is, now we look at the individual rocks, and it's just obvious that when you look at the fossils, that testifies to the fact they had to be formed rapidly. But there's other evidence as well. How do these layers form, these bedded layers? Well, we can reproduce this in the laboratory. When sediment is transported and deposited, certain things change: temperature, direction, the velocity, the texture of the bottom of the bed that would affect velocity. There are about 17 factors that have to remain constant for a single bed to be formed. When you change any of them, it got a new bedding plane. Well, how long is all of that going to remain constant? This is what they have been experimenting with. Van Joplin has spent millions of dollars at Harvard with his flumes and all of his experimentation. He says it's reasonable to postulate a very rapid rate of deposition. There is factual evidence from both field observation and experiment. Now, this is the way you do science. You do field observations, you do experiments. There's factual evidence that laminae, or layers composed of bed material, are commonly deposited by current action within a period of seconds or minutes. Factual evidence, field observation and experiment. Not millions of years, we can see it. And it's not possible to take a long time. It's a period of seconds, which you would know if you take time to look at the fossils in the rocks. You have to have it that way. We look at these layers, and we know the layers form rapidly. I mean, and that's being conceded. And I would say, while it's not in the textbooks, the leading authorities would. In fact, I was lecturing at A&M, and one of the professors stood up and said, "You dummy, we understand that. We know the individual layers formed rapidly." I said, "Well, why don't you put it in the textbooks?" Well, we'll get to that. Well, how do they answer? The individual layers form rapidly. Where is the time then? We know there's millions of years represented there. Well, today's answer to that is that the time is in between the layers. We know the individual layers form rapidly, she says. That you mean where there is no evidence? And she's saying that actually that's overstating her case. There is evidence there, and it's negative to her position. But the idea is, here's this stack of layers. That's where they put the time, because they know the layers from experiment as well as from observation of the fossils. They know it had to form quick. So they try to put it in between, like a shoehorn. Almost like the story of Cinderella and her ugly stepsisters. They're going to shoehorn that foot into the shoe, whether it fits or not. Notice this kind of thinking, and I don't think I'm misrepresenting them. This is Derek Eger, who at the time this was written was president of the British Geological Association. He's recently deceased. And notice the title of his book, and this shows the revolution in thinking. I call it a revolution, they wouldn't, but they're learning that catastrophe is what geology is about, and things had to happen quickly, and he's calling this the new catastrophism, which is bolder than most geologists would. But he's a leader in the field, and he says we can't escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid, catastrophic even. Indeed, at other times, there were long breaks. That's where the faith comes in. Because you can't have long periods of time, which he firmly believes in, if the rocks all form rapidly, unless you got long breaks in between the rocks. Other times they're long breaks, though it looks uniform and continuous. It doesn't look like breaks, but we know it has to be because we see, and it looks uniform and continuous. Now, if you got long breaks, you have erosion, and erosion doesn't leave straight level lines, does it? But that's what you've got. But we know because we know there's a long time, and that's the way the thinking is. They just shoehorn it in between. Well, we can test that. But notice the way he shoehorns the idea here. The geologic record is constantly lying to us, Egger says. It pretends to tell us the whole truth when it's only telling us a very small part of it. Nowhere in the world is the record or even part of it complete. There's all of this erosion in between that we can't see that represents the time that's gone. It may seem paradoxical, but to me the gaps, that is the lack of evidence, covers most of Earth history, not the dirt that happens to accumulate in the moments in between. It was during the breaks that most of the events probably occurred. It's the gaps that really matter. The lack of evidence is where you put your whole ball game. Now, I'm sorry, that's not science. That's just insisting that you shoehorn your idea into evidence that's not there. But that's the way they're thinking. This is the representative of the thought processes today. Let's look in between the layers. Here we're looking at in the Grand Canyon. Here's the Coconino Sandstone, the Hermit Shale. There's supposed to be 10 million years missing here, and it left a straight knife edge that you can trace for over 300 miles. 110 million years of erosion. Does that look like 110 million years of erosion? What does erosion look like? When you have a surface exposed, you have little plants that send roots down. You have what's called bioturbidation. When this happens down at the bottom of the ocean, the layer is laid down. You have the little plants that send, and they just plow up. You don't see any of that in these layers. They're just straight and level. It looks uniform and continuous. And then in between the layers, you see these, what they call ephemeral markings, little marks that are going to last just very, very briefly, like bird tracks. How long are bird tracks going to last in the mud? Not long. First, the rock had to form quickly, and then the next rock had to come over the top of it in order to preserve it, or erosion would have taken that away very quickly. When you look in between the rocks, you don't see millions of years of erosion. You don't see tens of years of erosion at this point. Ripple marks are probably the most common feature in between the layers of the rocks. Anybody here seen a ripple mark in a rock? Sure, you see these. In fact, it's been said you follow any bedding plane far enough, you'll find ripple marks indicated in the rocks. It's the most common feature you see. Schrock, in his rock book, I was taught from, again, 2 different universities, because they're one of the commonest, most widespread original sedimentary features. Ripple marks are preserved in conglomerates, sandstones, siltstones, clastic limestones, dole stones. Many examples have been described in rocks of all ages, I would say all environments, but you find them everywhere, all kinds of rocks, all, quote, ages of rocks. It's the most common feature, and any bedding plane, you follow it far enough. Well, let's think about the ripple marks. Here they are with dinosaur tracks down at Glen Rose. In order to preserve that, it's got to be like concrete. It's got to harden rapidly. That's what it takes to preserve tracks. But then you get it hard, and it just sits there exposed to the elements and bioturbidation for tens of years, and it's not going to look like this. So you have to have not only the host rock formed rapidly, you have to have the next rock on top of that formed rapidly to preserve these ephemeral markings. And you see the matrix had to be rapid. You see the next layer had to be rapid. And when you look at the Grand Canyon and you see that one after the other, each bedding plane followed far enough, you find a ripple mark that says each layer was rapid. The one on top of it was rapid. The one on top of that came rapidly afterwards. One after the other, uniform and continuous, is what this says, and it just shouts it loudly when you look at the rocks. This is not a long period of time. This is necessarily a short period, a catastrophic event. Over, I think, a year's time, a series of catastrophes laid down in what all of the geologists who formed the discipline thought produced the record of the rocks, the catastrophic record of the flood. But they're going to shoehorn millions of years in between. Let me show you a real killer argument. Now, you have to think a little bit with me now. This is a very famous formation in the Grand Canyon, the Redwall Mississippian. You can see it from a great distance. It's a very dramatic layer. That's almost halfway up the column. Underneath it directly is the Muav Cambrian. The Cambrian is the bottom layer of the geologic column. Skips all the way up to the Redwall Mississippian. Well, that's not that big a problem for an evolutionist. There are 200 million years of evolution in between, almost 200. Okay, that's possible, and they'll say, well, you can't have deposition everywhere continuously. If you have deposition here, you've got to have erosion somewhere else. So here there was erosion that left a straight level line for 300 miles that we can see. That's hard to swallow, but it gets worse. Look at the interface between these two layers. Here we're looking at the Redwall, followed by the Muav. But then we have the Redwall again, and then we have the Muav again, and then we have the Redwall again, and then the Muav, and then the Redwall again, and then the Muav. Back and forth 8 times. Now, how in the world? You skip 200 million years, and then you go back 200 million years, and then you skip 200 million years, and you go back 200 million. These were interbedded. What we learn in stratigraphy, one of the axioms, if layers are interbedded, they are contemporary, laid down at the same time, have to be. But the geologic column says these layers are 200 million years apart. What do I know about that statement from the geologic column? That just is not true. It is proved here. It looks uniform and continuous, and it is uniform and continuous, and you can't shoehorn the time in between. It's not in the layers, and it's not in between the layers. So where's the time? I don't think it's there. I think that's the most scientific answer. In this area, you're certainly familiar with Mount St. Helens, and this provides a laboratory of catastrophism that shows us what happens. Not as big a catastrophe as what the Bible describes, but certainly a big one. This blew its top 1980 in May, and just sent a tremendous pyroclastic cloud out across the countryside at about 150 miles per hour, laying down huge layers of sediment, providing a layer of trees here on top of Spirit Lake and a dam that finally broke and eroded down through the newly laid sediment almost 600 feet, well over 600 feet thick in some instances, laid down basically one afternoon with this gully down in between, and looking at it, it looks very similar in some instances to the Grand Canyon, with that little trickle down the middle, that little bitty trickle down there carved that whole canyon. You think? No, I think the same kind of phenomenon is seen when you look at the Grand Canyon. There was a whole lot of water quickly, not a little bit of water a long time. Same result. But obviously here, a lot more water was involved. This is what's left. And I think likewise what we're looking at the Grand Canyon. But looking at the phenomenon, you see layered rock. And we were taught these layers at least a year per layer, and usually much more than that. And we had assignments. You go out and you count the layers, and you can tell how many thousands of years were involved here. This was done basically one afternoon. And it formed layers, catastrophically. finely laminated layers, not 1 year per layer, but the whole 600-foot sequence over about 3 months. But that just says this idea of 1 year per layer, or more than that in many instances, is obviously not true. But looking at these layers with this erosion down to the middle and the little stream left, that looks dramatically like what you see out at the Grand Canyon, doesn't it? About a 40th scale Grand Canyon, the same kind of side slumping canyons, same geomorphology that you see in the canyon. Doesn't that look like the canyon? I'm sorry, that is the Grand Canyon. Now, this is Mount St. Helens. I think I know how the Grand Canyon formed. Why? Because I see something that looks just like it. But we think it formed a different way. Did you see it? No, but we have this theory. I think we ought to go with what we see. That's the way science proceeds, with experiment, with demonstration. It reminds me of this sign a friend of mine, or cartoon a friend of mine drew. This million-year-old canyon was formed by Mount St. Helens in 1980. That's kind of like the thinking you see at the canyon sometimes. But it demonstrates catastrophism and what we know happens. And of course, you've been to caverns where they show you the speleotherms, the stalactites, stalagmites, which takes hundreds of thousands of years to form. In my textbook at Indiana University, I was told 1 cubic inch took 100,000 years to form. And so you get out your calculations, you see the volume of material here, and you can calculate the hundreds of thousands of years involved. This is in a cave up in North Alabama. But very similar, the one just prior to that is 8 miles from, well, I'll go into the whole story in a minute. We're looking here at Vincennes, Indiana. This is George Rogers Clark Memorial. The limestone from this building was taken 8 miles from the cave we just looked at, Blue Springs Cave near Bedford, Indiana. This is on the banks of the Wabash River, clay bank, and there they built this limestone building. Well, the water percolates down through the cracks in this. They didn't do a good job of sealing it off. It was just there to house, be a monument. And down in the basement, you've got speleotherms, the stalactites and the stalagmites. They're 5 columns up to 11 feet tall in the basement of this building, which was 40 years old when this picture was taken. Now, there's an interesting story that goes along with that. They were trying their best to keep me out of that, and I had to get pressure from the one who controlled the purse strings for the monuments through the legislature of the state of Louisiana, of Indiana. And finally, they ushered me in. It was obvious they were going to lose their funding if they didn't. And we took the pictures. In Dallas, this article appeared in the Dallas Morning News, 1994, hanging from the ceiling beam in the 40-year-old building's basement are several rolls of formations not usually seen so close to ground level, stalactites. Yep, stalactites, more than 100 of the squiggly, slippery rock formations that thousands of people pay to see in places named Carlsbad and Mammoth. They are natural cave formations, pure and simple, in a 40-year-old building. And it's not that unusual. We saw several of them in some of the older buildings in Jerusalem in November that I took pictures of. This is this is a 30-year-old tunnel in New Zealand, a zinc mine. You see across the center this concrete bunker, and you see the people down the lower right-hand corner for scale. Happened in 30 years. It doesn't take a long time. Now, what is it that does? Well, petrifying things takes a long time, doesn't it? This is a boot that I found out in West Texas, near Ira Ann, Texas. The boot itself is not petrified, but on the inside, the cowboy leg is. The bone and even the flesh is preserved in this boot. You can see even the festered part of the wound is turned into rock. And where we had the CAT scan done to show the bones down in the boot, they were just amazed at the porous and the wound that was petrified turned into rock. We call him the limestone cowboy. But again, it doesn't take a long time. One of my favorite rocks is this hat from that mine in New Zealand, which is not a hat anymore. It's a rock. which took hundreds of thousands of years to form, obviously. You think? No, this isn't the briar patch. I like to go in here. What is it that's old? Everything you look at over and over again is obviously just the opposite. You see rapid and continuous layers, not slow, gradual processes. You see the detailed polystrate fossil, poly means many strata, many layers, like the trees going upright, the shrimp and the fish and the ferns and the tall trees. You see the continuous sequential layers, one that had to come right after the other, indicated by the ripple marks and the ephemeral tracks demonstrated by Mount St. Helens. You see coal. We didn't get to talk about oil. We do that in the lab in 20 minutes. Doesn't take a long time. They tried to use a long process, didn't work. They finally tried it quickly and it worked a whole lot better. Organic material, garbage, heat, pressure, 20 minutes, you got oil. It's not that difficult. Cave formations we see forming rapidly. When you look at these geologic phenomena that are supposed to indicate great ages, it just looks old. Well, no. The more you look, it doesn't look old at all. It looks rapid and continuous. And catastrophic. Petrification likewise. That's the message. Now, why do you think the Earth's old? Radiometric dating is not a good answer. And the geologic phenomenon is not. In fact, both of those come out to be pointing in the opposite direction when you look at all of the evidence. We didn't look at the young Earth evidence in this session. We're mainly looking at their evidence, why they say it's old, but there is a tremendous amount. We'll just briefly run through some examples that are given by Stanfield. He's the anti-creationist in California. In his book, Science of Evolution, he said, well, yes, there is some young Earth evidence, and he refers to water from volcanoes. And that's pretty impressive, as well as lava from volcanoes. You take, for example, the fact there are 600 active volcanoes in the world today, roughly. There are 10,000 inactive. I think that was going on at the time of the flood, but that's what we see. You take the average volcano, and typically one that's studied a lot and is generally considered average is Paracotin down in Mexico. And looking at the water that comes from it, here's the H and the O, the H2O getting together the first time, juvenile water being formed, and that's the major part of the gas coming out of volcano. There's a lot of it coming out. Now, if you got 600 active, and that's been going on for billions of years, average volcano like this, how much water are you going to have? Well, 70, like Paracotin, would fill the ocean in a billion years, the time that the ocean's supposed to have been around. Well, we got 600 active, we got 10,000 inactive, and only 70 would fill the ocean, and nobody thinks all the water in the ocean came from volcanoes. There's a problem here. We look at 600 that we have now active would fill the ocean 8 times. You see the problem they've got. Just 4, like Paracotin for a billion years, would account for the whole crust of the Earth, and a very small portion of the crust of the Earth is volcanic. Something's wrong here if you're looking at indications of the age of the Earth. Pressure in oil reservoirs is something that Stanfield pointed to. We drilled down there in Texas into the oil reservoirs. We got tremendous pressure. Sometimes you'll see in the old movies the rig blown up into the sky because of the tremendous pressures. Well, how long will rock retain those pressures? Well, that's a fairly simple problem. You have to study the porosity of the rock to understand how it can hold oil. That's one of the major factors you're looking for. If you know the porosity of the rock, the pressure, you know how long that'll last, well, you do the calculations. The pressures we're looking at there could not be maintained more than just tens of thousands of years. One estimated, granting the most ridiculous assumptions, maybe 60,000 maximum, and it'd all be gone. But they're saying billions of years, and certainly it's not gone. It's still there. That indicates youth. Uranium in the ocean, we can measure very accurately. We see how it's building up. How long would it take to get the present amount? Well, just a few thousand years, maybe 12 to 13 at the present rate. Radiocarbon in the atmosphere is building up. How long would it take to get to the present? Well, just a few thousand years. Helium in the atmosphere, likewise. Meteoric dust in the strata. He says you find no meteorites. Here's this record of all of the ages preserved in the geologic column, and no meteorites in it. Now, wait a minute. If all these meteorites are raining down, it ought to be preserved in this. Meteorites and meteoric dust likewise have been measured. It indicates just a few thousands of years. Population dynamics we talked about earlier today likewise indicate few. These are all indications of young Earth. We could do an hour lecture on each one of them to really nail it down and to show you this is very good evidence. Even Stanfield, the anti-creationist, is acknowledging it. But he says we have radiometric dating, and yes, it's not dependable, but I'm going to have faith in it. And that's the way he reasons. Let's weigh the evidence. Let's be honest. The evidence for, the evidence against. You've got a lot of evidence for a young Earth. You've got some evidence for the old Earth, the geologic phenomenon, the layers, the fossils, but that really doesn't say much about an old Earth. And the radiometric dating, that's just not really good evidence. You've got a little bit, and it's not very good, compared to a whole lot more that's very strong. Now, as a scientist, what should you conclude? What's the most scientific conclusion about the age of the Earth? I don't think we can draw a fine line and say 7,000 years. I think you can do that with Revelation, or close to that. But you can say thousands of years is a much more scientific answer than millions and certainly billions. And I think that is the most scientific, honest conclusion about the scientific evidence for the age of the Earth. We have more and we have better evidence than they have for the old age of the Earth. And so the best scientific conclusion is the Earth is not old. It's young. Now, if it's young, you can't explain it naturalistically, can you? That, of course, says creation. That's where the resistance comes from. You can't say, well, you don't have to worry, there's a judgment coming. No, we've been here for billions and billions of years. The beginning is a long time ago. You don't have to worry about the end next Thursday, do you? You see the philosophical pressures involved. If you can stiff-arm the beginning, you're stiff-arming the end. If the beginning was just a short time ago, obviously supernatural, then the end is staring you right in the face, and it's realistic. And I think that's the implication of what we see in geology. It certainly conforms with what the Word of God says and actual explanation for origins. All right, let's see if some of you have some questions. Yes, let's wait for the mic here, right down here.
Okay. I agree with what you're saying, but I was curious, what is your opinion? Over in Wyoming, between Sheraton and Dayton, there's a canyon that runs through there, and they've dated that wall clear back into the dinosaur and stuff like that. What do you think about the accuracy of that?
Well, it's like dating the Grand Canyon. It's all over the place. Now, when they start dating the layers with the dinosaurs in it, then they're going to have to come out with Cretaceous, Jurassic, which gives them constraints. If it doesn't come out in that period, they chuck it. Now, we can see canyons like that forming virtually overnight. There was one in National Geographic recently close to Mount St. Helens in the aftermath that formed within 10 years, and it's this huge canyon. It looks like, in fact, the article said it looks like tens of thousands of years, and it formed within 10. What we see is rapid. Now, they believe, they have faith that it's old. But when we look, for example, tomorrow night at evidence that humans and dinosaurs were together, coexisted, then I think it just blows it all out of the water that it was millions of years ago. It doesn't work. So you got to come back tomorrow night to see the rest of it. Other questions? Yes.
The cowboy boot that you had, how, time-wise, I mean, that was like a new boot. How could it be petrified so fast? Did you think he got caught in a cast?
I'm not sure that the boot itself isn't. But the leg inside is. We did some research on that, and this boot was manufactured by the Letty Boot Company, a famous boot company out in San Angelo. I looked up one of the owners at the time we had concluded it came from, and I walked in, and I had called the fellow on the phone, told him what we'd found, asked him if he could identify it for us, and he walked in. That's the number 10 stitch pattern. I did that for years and years. He said that boot was made back in the early 50s. So we know exactly where it came from. It was a custom-made boot, and it's pretty easy to identify. Now, the circumstances, we know things, and there are certain lines of evidence that are significant scientifically to the scientist, and there are others that are that are significant for the general audience, because the general audience has been lied to. And this is one of those. Now, the scientists know it's not as significant scientifically because they know it happens quickly. They've seen this over and over, but they've lied to the audience, to the general populace about it. And so when people see that boot, they say, wow, I've been lied to. And you have. And you need to know that. But when I'm talking to a scientist will say, well, yeah, we know that. That can happen quickly. We did an experiment out at Yellowstone National Park. There you have the geothermal pools, high silica concentration, high temperature. These are perfect conditions for petrification. So we took a log, tied a rope around it, and threw it in the pool, and came back 3 months later, and not only was the log petrified, so was the rope. I have a friend of mine who's using that area to dangle little teddy bears over the steam and heat that's coming up from it. It takes about 2 weeks to petrify the teddy bear, and he's selling them and to creationists, not selling many to evolutionists. But if you want one, I can get you one. Yeah. It does not take a long time to petrify things, is the point, and they know it. They've just been lying to you about it. Other questions? Yes.
Do you see scientific advances in technology as answering some of these questions, either for either side down the road? It seems like in the last 100 years, things are, of course, increasing rapidly.
I think it's getting more difficult. Certainly that's the case in biology that we were just looking at a moment ago in the previous lecture. In microbiology, we're learning so much about that, quote, simple cell that it just, every day, it just defies the ability to describe. It's so incomprehensibly complex. That cell has been compared to like New York City. And here's all of these thousands of things going on, coordinated at the same time in factories that are building things, and each one dependent on the other and interconnected in the simplest cell. And the more we learn about this, it's just, you take the bacterial flagellum, this little tail that sticks out of the back of the bacteria. It's powered by a motor. It looks, when you get the electron microscope, you see the statum, all of the parts of a motor, electric motor, are there. And this thing will go at like 100,000 revolutions per minute and then reverse itself in a quarter a turn, just back the other way. It just defies anything we've got. And so we're learning more technologically. We're getting more insight, especially in microbiology. In geology, they're playing a lot of games. We are finding the thing that is probably causing more problems in geology is we keep finding things where we're not supposed to find them. And people finding them and publishing and getting it published somehow without, they can't, if it's way out of line, it won't be published. But sometimes they get it passed before they know better. And especially if they've got some kind of, but it's really messing up the picture the more we're finding. And especially down in the lower part of the Cambrian, it's supposed to be the bottom layer. We just got it all down there now. There are no major phylum that we can't find in the bottom part of the Cambrian. Well, that's not the way it's supposed to work. We'll talk more about that when we look at the fossil record. good question.
I have a sister that told me the air is about 8,000 years. And I always say, to me, it's more older than that, and I don't have no proof. How can I answer?
I think biblically, we can show that the earth was created about 7,000 years ago. And I think there's good evidence from eyewitness testimony and from fulfilled prophecy to believe that. Now, that's totally separate from what we're looking at tonight, but it's in harmony with it. There's nothing I know in science that would contradict that. I can't with science draw the line that fine, but it is certainly concordant.
When you say like simple cell, are you talking like amoeba, single cell type of thing, or is there a specific one?
You know, some of them have the nucleus. Some of the one without the nucleus is supposed to be the simplest, though there have been some discoveries this year about those cells that are mind-blowing, and maybe the ones without the nucleus are more complex, more involved. That has been questioned seriously by the evolutionists themselves. So that, quote, simplest cell without the nucleus is itself mind-boggling. But the bacterial cells, usually what they're referring to, are in that neighborhood. Blue-green algae is supposed to be the most primitive. Yeast, sometimes. Other questions?
On those trees that you showed us pictures of extending through several strata of sedimentary rock, supposedly representing several million years of accumulation, have our evolutionist friends thought about identifying what kind of trees those are and making fence posts out of it?
They make good fence posts. They're petrified. Yes, they've been identified. Lepidodendron is one that we found 2 or 3 times. That's actually a big fern. We get the idea that everything was smaller back then and they've gotten bigger. It's absolutely the other way around. That's just a brainwashed lie they've told. The little ferns today that are 18 inches tall were 120 feet tall in the fossil record. Invariably, if you find something analogous today, it was much bigger in the fossil record, just over and over again. That's a lecture we didn't get to, but we illustrate that with several dozen examples. Pigs that were 6 feet tall at the shoulder, camels 20 feet tall at the shoulder. I mean, this is typical of what you see. But that particular tree is not a lepidodendron, and I'm not remembering now exactly what it was. I don't want to commit till I look. In Nova Scotia, there's an example of about 100 of those trees that are upright, and all of those are lepidodendron. That's a big fern that's often associated with coal seams. Other questions? Now, we thank you very much for your attention this evening. I think you might be able to tell I enjoy talking about this. We're having fun, and just following the evidence wherever it leads and just watching them squirm when they don't want to fall. Tomorrow night is my favorite. It represents some of the work that we've been doing down at Glen Rose and some controversial evidence. A lot of people will tell you all about it, but don't have any idea what they're talking about and haven't seen it. If you want to see for yourself, you can come see and decide. I think we can show you that humans and dinosaurs lived together, and there's proof beyond any shadow of a doubt. If that's the case, they're not millions of years apart. The geologic column is wrong. We're going to be looking at the area of geology, the record of the rocks, and I think it provides very strong, positive, unanswerable evidence. And we'll look at some of the answers they try to give, and it's entertaining. We hope you can be back with us tomorrow night.